Well, good Thursday evening. Meteorologist Evan Stewart here at WVEC Channel 1313 News Now, bringing you another edition of Hurricane Hub Live as we start the month of July here, the 2nd of July. And what do we have on tap for Hurricane Hub Live tonight? Well, the first thing is all is quiet on the eastern front, talking about the Atlantic Ocean. We've only had one named tropical system. We'll talk a little bit more about why things have been so quiet. We have a tropical storm in the Pacific. That is Tropical Storm Douglas. It's not expected to last very long, but it will have some minor impacts here across portions of the U.S. from some of the distant clouds and some of the distant moisture from Douglas. And then we have a potential super typhoon that is in the central Pacific that could impact Guam late into the weekend, an area that was just hit back in April by a super typhoon. So we'll talk about that. And then if we have time, we'll take a look back at some history and how weather has helped change the United States. And we'll talk about a couple of hurricanes that have really had an impact across the United States. So we'll begin here in the Atlantic. As I mentioned, all is quiet right now in the Atlantic Ocean. Some of the areas that we look for development are usually closer to our land masses, although once we get into mid and late July, that's when we start to look more towards the intertropical convergence zone. But right now, it's quiet here through the Gulf, through the Caribbean, off the east coast of the United States. You might remember a couple of days ago, we were talking about a little weak system that had a 10 to 20% chance of development. That was with a cold front that moved through over the weekend. Said that sometimes fronts will move through, and as they stall, they can spin up something off the southeast coastline. Sometimes we could see something try to develop in the Gulf. That hasn't been the case so far, with the cold front that we had that moved through over the weekend, and that system pretty much, again, just fizzled out. But you'll notice, again, all is quiet here through the rest of the tropical Atlantic. Just a few little, clusters of thunderstorms, but nothing that's really organizing. And one of the reasons is because of the Saharan dust that is out there. And it's not just the dust. This is just what's easy for, some of the instruments to measure, but it's also some very, very dry airs, the Saharan dust layer, or the SAL. And that is this dust that comes here off the Sahara Desert. And our tropical systems, a lot of times, typically form off the coast of Africa by the Cabo Verde Islands and trek across the Atlantic towards the Caribbean, the U.S., or into the Gulf. But when you have that dry air out there, it just really inhibits the development of tropical systems. And you'll notice here, as we go through the next week or so, still copious amounts of dust coming off the coast of Africa right into our main development zone for tropical systems. So we are looking at a very quiet week coming up into the Atlantic Ocean. And as we take a look at the Atlantic tropical activity, you can see here that, from June into July, there isn't much rise here until we get really into August. And a lot of that is because of that dry air, that dust that's coming off the coast of Africa, and that dry layer that is moving off the coast. So that's why, the activity is very limited in June and July and really doesn't ramp up until August. And that's when we start to see that air moisten up and the potential for the development of the stronger system. So again, we only have one tropical storm so far. That was the short-lived Arthur in the Gulf. Our next named system would be Bertha. But again, we're not expecting anything over the next week. Some of the main development areas for the month of July. You can mention some of our homegrown storms. Water temperatures really starting to heat up in the Gulf, and we can see that development here move through areas of the Gulf Coast of the United States. So that's one of four main development areas. The other here in the Western Caribbean, again, the waters, they're typically a little bit warmer, and sometimes those systems will move up into the Gulf as well. Mention the possibility, over the weekend that there could be something that develops here off the U.S. coast. Again, it only was about a 10 to 20% chance, and it didn't develop, but that is another area where we could see some of those homegrown storms, sometimes with a stalled front or just a weak area of low pressure that gets over the warmer Gulf Stream waters and starts to intensify here by the Bahamas or just off of our coastline. The fourth area, as we mentioned, down here, this is when we start to see some development in our main development region here from the Cabo Verde Islands over towards the Lesser and Greater Antilles. That's usually later into the month of July. Again, we mentioned because right now, as is typical, we have a lot of that African dust coming off the coast of Africa. So for a little bit more about what that Saharan dust layer is and what it does and how it impacts the development, Chief Meteorologist Tim Pandages has a story on the Saharan dust layer.
Each year, as the Atlantic hurricane season begins, a powerful atmospheric feature makes its presence known: dust. Not just any dust, but a vast plume from the Sahara Desert, traveling thousands of miles across the Atlantic. This is the Saharan air layer, and it plays a surprising role in shaping weather and supporting ecosystems. Now, NOAA defines SAL, or Saharan air layer, as a hot, dry, dusty air mass that forms over the Sahara from late spring to early fall. Now, like clockwork, monsoonal storms over Africa's Sahel region lifts huge amounts of dust in the atmosphere. Strong upper-level winds then carry the dust westward across the Atlantic, forming a distinct layer. This dry air suppresses hurricane development by starving storms of moisture and tearing apart developing systems, often keeping the tropics quiet early in the season. Now, eventually, the dust transport fades or shifts, allowing storms to form more freely. But the SAL isn't just about storms. The dust is actually rich in iron and nutrients, fertilizing the Atlantic and fueling phytoplankton blooms, the base of the marine food chain. Some of it even reaches the Amazon, replenishing rainforest soil. It also contributes to stunning sunrises and sunsets. However, dense dust plumes can lower air quality across the Caribbean and southern U.S., and this tends to aggravate respiratory problems for those sensitive individuals and sensitive groups. Now, as we track the tropics this season, keep an ear out for Saharan dust. For 13 News Now, I'm Chief Meteorologist Tim Pandages.
And yes, it's pretty fascinating that that dust travels across the Atlantic and then ends up, across parts of the Amazon, bringing, as Tim mentioned, some very vital nutrients there through parts of the Americas. Now, speaking of the Americas, we have a lot going on in North America. It's the FIFA World Cup, and it's underway, and many cities spent months making sure that everything runs smoothly. But as we know, weather can be unpredictable. Here's how folks can prepare for a storm if it was to hit one of those hurricane-prone areas.
There are a number of the World Cup venues which are in the zone which do get impacted by tropical cyclones during the season. And particularly we're looking at the venues in Miami and Houston on the Gulf of Mexico. There are some inland sites as well which can sometimes see the kind of remnants of tropical cyclones once they've moved inland have impacts. And I'm thinking of the three Mexican venues and potentially Atlanta, Dallas as well. So all those are sites which we're watching for in terms of potential tropical cyclone activity. But I think the thing to bear in mind is that the World Cup is obviously happening in June and July. And although the hurricane season does nominally run from June through to November, most activity actually occurs in the kind of August to October period. So actually, during the first couple of months of the season, June and July, there can be tropical cyclones, but they're much less frequent and generally tend to be weaker than later in the season.
FIFA and the host committee have all been putting out messaging, and we will continue to put out that messaging to all of those visitors that are coming into Miami-Dade County, because you got a lot of people that are from, for example, the Scots are coming in June and July. You know what the weather is like here. Those poor folks don't know what they're going to get hit with this, the temperature rises when they get here. So, yes, we've been preparing for it.
If there are any storms which develop or have the potential to develop over the next few days, then the National Hurricane Center issues a whole suite of products, both graphical media, social media, and they get videos out there into the mainstream media as well in the USA. So I think the key thing to say to people going out there is just keep an eye on media and social media, because if there is a tropical storm develop, you'll certainly hear about it through media and social media, and then take action as advised by the agencies which are warning you. The impact of El Nino on Atlantic tropical cyclone activity is actually to suppress the activity. And in the recently issued seasonal forecasts for Atlantic tropical cyclone activity. Nearly every forecast is suggesting we'll have a season with less than usual activity right across the region and across the whole season from June to November. Now, that doesn't mean that we won't get any storms, and obviously it only takes one storm in a season to have an impact in one particular location. So it's not out of the question we could get tropical storms, even though we're moving into an El Nino. And I think if you look back in history, the last time we had a really strong El Nino, which did suppress Atlantic tropical cyclone activity, was in 2015. Yet still, there was an early season tropical storm in the Gulf of Mexico called Bill, which had impacts on Texas. It wasn't particularly strong in terms of its wind strength, but it did produce some heavy rainfall and flooding impacts. So even though we're moving into an El Nino, we can't rule out the possibility of tropical storm activity early in the season.
And of course, the World Cup runs through, I think it's July 19th, so we still have a ways to go. Now, when we come back, we'll talk about what's going on in the Pacific. Welcome back to Hurricane Hub Live. As we transition from the Atlantic to the Pacific, you heard on that package how we were talking about El Nino, and that's that abnormal warming of the waters here off the coast of South America. And this is a look at the sea surface temperature anomalies, and where we see the brighter colors, that's where it's warmer than average, and where we see the blues, that's where the water temperatures are colder than average. So we are looking at that development here of an El Nino and potentially a super El Nino as we go here later into the year. As far as what's developing out in the Pacific Ocean, there's only one tropical system, and it is right here. That is Tropical Storm Douglas that formed yesterday. Right now it's about 1,180 miles west-southwest of the southern tip of Baja California. Winds of 40 miles per hour. You can see it's really split between Mexico and the island of Hawaii out here off towards the west of the system. And Douglas is just going to drift off towards the north here, eventually weaken to a remnant area of low pressure as we head into the weekend. And by Sunday, just a 25-mile-per-hour storm with weakening areas of wind. But one thing you will notice is as the storm's spinning around, when we take a look at the stream of clouds here and the jet stream, it is pulling some of the clouds and some of that moisture, some of the outer fringes up here towards Baja California and then even up into areas of the central U.S., kind of almost part of that big heat dome that we have here over the eastern United States. So just another example of how all the weather really through much of North America is sort of connected, as some of that moisture and some of that cloud cover here from Douglas gets pulled up through Mexico and rides along that heat dome ridge that we have here in the eastern United States, where we're looking at temperatures again here through Independence Day weekend up into the 90s, and feels like temperatures into the low 100s, 100 to 110 degrees for much of the central and eastern parts of the United States. So that's what's going on in the Pacific, at least in the eastern Pacific. When we come back, we'll talk about Typhoon Bavi and how it could have impacts on the Mariana Islands and Guam. Welcome back to Hurricane Hub Live. We talked about the eastern, or the Atlantic and the eastern Pacific. Now let's head to the central Pacific, and you might notice, yeah, we've got something swirling out here. This is a brand new typhoon that is going to have some impacts here through the Mariana Islands and Guam, which of course, you know, is a territory of the United States. We have a base there, and you know, they're already starting to prepare. And just a few months ago, this area was hit by Super Typhoon Sinlaki. So that was back in April. So another super typhoon, this is Typhoon Bavi, is now projected to hit the Mariana Islands. Right now, winds of 80 miles per hour with gusts up to 100. And this is the forecast track for the system to become a super typhoon with winds of 160 miles per hour by Saturday, and then by Sunday, 160 mile per hour system continuing here off towards the northwest. And again, this would make it, you know, stronger than a Category 5, as strong as a Category 5 hurricane in the Atlantic. And again, here you can see the island of Guam and the Mariana Islands. So we are looking here as we head late into the weekend of seeing this super typhoon. Again, here are the Mariana Islands. And here it is coming Friday, and this is local time in Guam. Can see that center and that eye of the storm here forecasted to pass just north of Guam. The good news is that would put Guam on the weaker side of the storm, but there are obviously other islands and other communities that are here through the Mariana Islands. So this would be Monday local time there. They have the potential of this super typhoon that will then move off towards the northwest. So I know, we have some folks who are interested in what's going on towards Guam and the Mariana Islands. So we wanted to mention our super typhoon that, again, hitting an area that just a couple months ago was hit by a super typhoon back in April. That was Sinlaku. Now, when we come back here on Hurricane Hub Live, we'll take a look back at a couple of stories that I did on how weather changed America, two of them focusing on hurricanes. This year I've been working on a series of stories on how weather has changed America for the 250th birthday. And some of those stories have been talking about how weather affected things on the battlefield, but some of the biggest moments in U.S. history didn't happen on battlefields or in government buildings, but in the middle of extreme weather. Let's take a look back at one of the deadliest storms on record and how it changed the way we warn people about hurricanes. In 1900, Galveston, Texas was one of the most important cities in the United States, a booming port town on the Gulf Coast. And the man in charge of watching the weather there was Isaac Klein. Klein led the Galveston Weather Bureau. That's the predecessor to today's National Weather Service. As a powerful hurricane approached on September 8, 1900, Klein made a critical decision. He unilaterally ordered hurricane warnings raised, urging people to move to higher ground. This was against Weather Bureau policy, which required authorization from the central office in Washington, D.C. And Klein later estimated that that decision saved thousands of lives. But the storm was still catastrophic. The storm surge rose more than 15 feet, sweeping across the low-lying island. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed, and an estimated 6,000 to 8,000 people were killed, making it the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history. In the aftermath, America changed how it warned people about hurricanes. Meteorologists were empowered to speak directly to the public, and coastal cities rethought how they prepare for storms. Galveston built a massive seawall and raised much of the city. And every hurricane warning issued today traces back to lessons learned here when one meteorologist chose action over protocol. And of course, that was in 1900 in Galveston. Now we take a look at another Gulf Coast storm about 100 years later. That's Hurricane Katrina, another one that people remember. Now, Hurricane Katrina revealed major failures in our country's emergency response, planning, and evacuation and disaster coordination. The storm reshaped FEMA and changed how America prepares for disasters to this day. Here's a breakdown. In August 2005, Hurricane Katrina changed America forever. The storm struck the Gulf Coast as a Category 3 hurricane, but the real disaster came after the storm left, when levees failed in New Orleans and floodwater swallowed much of the city. Shocking scenes unfolded live on television, families trapped on rooftops, thousands stranded inside the Louisiana Superdome, and rescue crews that were overwhelmed. More than 1,800 people died. But Katrina didn't just show us the power of nature, it exposed failures in emergency response. Communication broke down between local, state, and federal agencies, and FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, faced intense criticism for its slow response. After Katrina, FEMA was reorganized. Evacuation plans were improved, and emergency alerts came faster and were more coordinated. The storm also changed how America viewed vulnerability, revealing how poverty, infrastructure, and preparedness can determine who survives a disaster. Katrina taught America a hard lesson. Sometimes the greatest disaster isn't the storm itself. It's what happens when the systems meant to protect us fail. Now, one of the ways that we warn people during hurricane season is the hurricane cone. But what exactly is it, and how does it help predict accurate weather? Meteorologist Craig Muller breaks that down.
Knowing exactly where hurricanes will go, it's a tricky business. When the National Hurricane Center issues forecasts, it uses a cone to project where the probable center of the storm will be over time. The cone is formed by enclosing the projected forecast area by circles at various points in time. The size of each circle is determined so that 2/3 of the 5-year historical forecast errors fall within the circle. Let me explain. 2/3 of the storms over the past 5 years wound up within 46 miles of where the storm was forecast to be out 24 hours. You go 48 hours out, the storms, 2/3 of the time, they fell within 79 miles. The farther out you go, the bigger the circle gets. By the time you get out 120 hours or 5 days, the circle encompassing 2/3 of the storms expands to have a radius of 240 miles. Now you simply connect those forecast circles and you get the area that's most likely to have the center of the storm over the coming days, making the cone of uncertainty. While the cone projects the probable track and timing of the center of the system, it's important to remember what it does not tell us. It doesn't speak to the size, the intensity, or the structure of the system. You'll need to turn to trusted meteorologists and the National Hurricane Center for information on that.
And for more information as hurricane season continues, visit the 13 News Now Hurricane Fast Facts playlist. You can find that on YouTube. You can get there by scanning the QR code on your screen. And there you'll find all kinds of information on supplies you should have on hand, emergency resources, storm facts, and more. And of course, scan this QR code to download the 13 News Now Hurricane Guide. It has information on supplies you should have on hand, emergency numbers you might need, and a whole lot more. For now, that's going to wrap it up here on Hurricane Hub Live on the 2nd of July. Of course, tomorrow's Independence Day. We'll have more on Hurricane Hub Live. And of course, Chief Meteorologist Tim Pandagis will be here back again next week. For now, Meteorologist Evan Stewart wishing you a good night.